Hey everyone, my name's Rabia and I'm here on behalf of Neural DSP to show you a brand new device featured in CorOS 3.3.0 taken from my archetype plugin called the Mono Synth. This is a subtractive mono synth loosely based on a Moog ladder filter. The way it works is based around pitch detection, so the exciting part of this is that you could plug a microphone in, a guitar, a bass, essentially anything that creates a pitch, and it will create synthesis. In this video, I'd like to show you how the mono synth works, how all the different parameters affect the sound, and then create some presets. And the truly exciting thing about this is that now we're not locked to a specific signal chain like we were in my archetype plugin, meaning that I can put the mono synth anywhere on the grid and combine it with any number of devices to create an endless amount of sounds. So without further ado, allow me to deep dive into the new mono synth on CorOS 3.3.0. So let me take you through the monosynth page by page and we'll listen to how the different parameters affect the sound of the monosynth. Let's hear how it sounds when you first load it up. As you could hear there, the monosynth was picking up all the nuances in my playing, such as vibrato and slides. And that's one of my favorite features of this monosynth because it's based on pitch detection, meaning it will capture all the nuances of your playing so you don't have to change the way that you play guitar to get the most out of this monosynth. Starting on the first page, global and amp. This is a kind of overall global parameter page for the mono synth. Starting with mix, of course that means how much of your dry signal is being added to the mono synth. So with it all the way down, we've got a clean DI, all the way up is pure mono synth. Next we have the sensitivity control. This determines how responsive the mono synth is to your playing dynamics. It's set to default at 50%. Now if you're using something like a single coil or a low output guitar, you might want to turn this up, and if you're using something higher output, you might want to turn this down just to get an accurate sort of dynamic response from the mono synth. For my guitar, in this setup, 50% works really well for me, so I'm going to leave it there. Next we have envelope retrigger. Now the best way to think about this is that every time I hit a note with envelope retrigger on, it's going to re-trigger the oscillators and create the synth sound. When you turn it off, it's only going to do it on certain notes with a certain amount of velocity. So it means for things like tapping or legato playing, it's going to be a little bit more responsive and give you a little less sort of start-stop synth tones. And now with the envelope retrigger off, next we have the built-in gate. Now this is different from a gate that you would find in Quad Cortex generally, in that what it stops from happening is a lot of glitches and pops and unwanted sounds. So if I turn it off, I can demonstrate. If I put it back to its default setting, next we have the sidechain source, which is where we determine the input signal is coming from into the mono synth. Because we now have the added flexibility of choosing where the mono synth sits in the signal chain, this drop-down menu allows us to determine where the synth is tracking from. So for example, with sidechain source off, that means wherever we're placed on the grid is just going to track from there. So that could be in front of an amplifier in a cab, after an amplifier in a cab, or after a delay, creating some really weird sounds. But if I go to the drop-down menu, I can now choose exactly where the synth is reading from. For example, input 1. Next up, we have the glide parameter. Now this is really cool. It's very common on a lot of synthesizers, but basically, if I play a note down here, for example, and then one up here, it's going to glide up to that note and it will do it slower the higher we turn it. So let's start by showing you what it sounds like off. Let's take it up to 150 milliseconds so we can hear how it sounds. And just for fun, let's turn it all the way up to 500 milliseconds. Next up, we have the output control, which is the master volume of the synth block. And this is useful if you're running it into another device that you want to drive harder, such as an amplifier. You just turn that output up and it's going to hit the front end of that amp a lot more. Next, we have the decay and the attack control. Now this is where we start to shape the sound of the synth. And what's really nice is that we've got a visual representation of what it's actually doing to the sound. So set in the middle is 0 milliseconds attack or decay, so it gives us a nice sustained synth note. As we turn this control counterclockwise, you'll notice that the note drops off a lot quicker. I like using this control in conjunction with the Arpeggiator, which I'll show you in a little bit, because it allows us to get some really cool rhythmic synth sounds. If I now turn this control clockwise, you'll start to hear the onset of the synthesizer happen a lot slower. Now we have envelope sustain. Now this is affecting the sustain of the attack and the release control, so they work together. If I turn the decay down and I turn the envelope sustain down, it's going to be a much more accurate, sharp, fast attack. Next, we have the MIDI channel control. This allows us to control the monosynth block externally with a different MIDI device. Certain parameters are disabled when using this feature, which are the sensitivity, the gate, the source, and the glide controls. The cool thing about this feature is that if my quad cortex is on the floor, I can have an external MIDI controller that's more easily accessible if I'm stood up. Moving on to the next page, the monosynth has a built-in arpeggiator. This is another really common feature in a lot of synthesizers, so it's incredible that they've managed to pack this into the monosynth. So looking at this page, you can see there's a slew of different controls. Along the top, we've got our scale, so we start with the root and then we go to the 8th step of the scale. Moving down, you can see the arpeggiator on and off control, which simply turns it on or off. If we move across, you can see root, or in other words, key, so we can choose what key our arpeggiator is working in, depending on the song that you're playing. So let me show you what the arpeggiator sounds like. At the minute, you can see we've got all 8 steps of our scale engaged, and we're currently set to a minor scale. So if I go ahead and turn the arpeggiator on, we should be able to hear a minor scale. Next, we have the root control, or in other words, key. So when that's turned off, it doesn't matter what note I play on my guitar, it's going to trigger the scale from whichever note I choose to play. Now, if I go ahead and open this drop-down menu, we can see all the different keys that are available. My guitar is tuned to C sharp. So if I go ahead and choose C sharp and start playing from that note, it's going to play a C sharp minor scale. The cool thing here is that if I move through the C sharp minor scale, it's going to follow me diatonically through each step of the scale, which is very, very cool. So as you could hear, that was a C sharp minor scale I was moving through. The next control is the scale control, which is minor or major. So I can go ahead and change that and do a C sharp major. For now, I'm going to turn those controls off so I can freely choose where I want the scale to start from. Moving on to the next control, the arpeggiator pattern. This is where we determine the order of the steps of the scale. So the default setting is the up pattern, moving up through the scale. If we move through, we can go down the scale. We then have up and down. Down and up. And then my personal favorite, random. At this point, I think it's a great opportunity to show you another cool feature. As I mentioned before, we have all 8 steps of the scale, but depending on which steps I want or don't want in my scale, I can simply press them and it gets rid of them from our arpeggio. Next up, we have the octave control. This gives us the opportunity to use 2 octaves above and below with our chosen arpeggio. Next up, we have the sync and tuning controls. This allows us to determine whether we want the tempo of the arpeggiator to be set by quad cortex. If we turn that off, it gives us free rate tuning in hertz. With it turned on, we can choose our sync note. At the minute, we're at 8th notes, but we can change that, be really fast or really slow, depending on what you want to do with it. Let's turn that off and I will use the free rate control. Where it gets fun is now if I use the octave control and the ARP pattern control, we can get some really cool arpeggios going. And finally, we have the tuning control. Most instruments in the modern day are tuned to 440 Hz, which is what this is set to as default. But of course, if you wanted to, we can change that. Moving on to the Oscillator page, this page has the most influence over the sound of the monosynth. Monosynth features 2 oscillators that we can change the pitch of, the tuning of, we can change the wave shape even. So starting along the top, we've got control of both oscillators. We can turn them on and off, and then we can of course change the different type of wave shape as well. For the purpose of showing you how they sound, I'm just going to turn off the second oscillator, and we'll start with sine wave. Moving on to sawtooth wave. Triangle. Square wave. Pulse. We have white noise and pink noise. These are really useful sounds to have in monosynth, especially when using both oscillators together. Just gives us more options for texture. So what I'd like to do is quickly blend two different wave shapes together so you can hear the sort of influence that these controls have over the overall monosynth tone. So on my first oscillator, I've got a sawtooth. And I'm going to choose a pulse wave shape on my second oscillator. Moving on, let's take a look at the parameters of the oscillators. The easiest way to think about this page is that we have the exact same amount of controls split down the middle of the page. We can control both of them in the exact same way. So let's focus on oscillator 1 for now. At the minute, we're using a sawtooth wave, and the first parameter on this particular oscillator is steps. In other words, semitones. So we can actually tune the oscillator how we want, up to 24 above or 24 below. Next up, we have the detune control for the oscillators. This works really well when using two oscillators at once because it essentially gives us a sort of phasey kind of sound, which is really nice for creating width and dimension. We then have an independent level control for each oscillator. This is also useful for sort of dialing in the level between both of them if one of them is a little bit more overpowering. Next, we have unison controls. These are some of my favorite parameters in monosynth. This allows us to stack multiple voices on top of each other, creating a lot of width, and we can do a lot more to the sound overall. First, we have unison source, which has a drop-down menu and that allows us to stack up to 5 voices to either oscillator 1, 2, or both. For now, I'm going to leave it on oscillator 1 and 2 and affect the whole sound. So the best way for me to demonstrate how influential this effect is over the sound, we need to do a few things. At the moment, unison width is all the way down. We only have one voice happening at the minute and there is no detune. So this is the most narrow version of the sound. First thing I'm going to do is add a unison and I'm going to bring up the unison detune. If we start adding unison width, the whole sound becomes a lot wider and a lot bigger. So now if we start adding more voices with the unison amount control, you'll notice the sound just gets bigger and thicker. Another thing I'm going to do is add more detune to the overall sound of oscillator 1 and 2, and it's going to create a really, really cool sound. Another thing I love doing here is harmonizing the oscillators. So I'm going to take oscillator 1 down 12 semitones, and then I'm going to boost oscillator 2 up 19 semitones. This is going to give me a really wide sort of fifth harmony going on. And finally, we have the filter page. This is where we can choose to cut out different frequencies and control the envelope of the filter. So firstly, along the top, you can see we've got a great visual representation of what the filter is doing to the sound of the monosynth. We have control to turn it on and off. And now if we start moving through the different parameters, I'll show you how it affects the sound. So the first thing to note here is that both the slope and the cutoff kind of work together. So if I play a note, you'll be able to hear just where we're at with regards to the frequency. Now, if I start moving down the cutoff, it's going to take away high end from the sound. The slope control affects how aggressive the cutoff is of the filter. In its lowest setting at 6 dB per octave, the slope is very gentle and subtle. In its highest setting at 24 dB per octave, it's a little more drastic. Moving on, the resonance control allows us to dial in a resonant peak in the filter, shown here by the visualizer. At 0%, we won't hear anything, but what I'm going to do is play a note, boost that, and you should be able to hear it. One thing that's cool to do here is use an expression pedal and map it to the cutoff control, and then we can get a really cool filter sweep sound. Next, we can add some grit using this drive control. This is something that I really like about the mono synth, and something you find on a lot of analog synths as well. And next we have envelope controls for the filter. This is really exciting because it responds to how dynamically you're playing. Let me show you what I mean. If I drop the envelope amount down to 50%, and then I use the decay and the attack knob, we can choose between an aggressive onset or a soft onset. So let's start by dropping the decay. Depending on how hard I hit the guitar, you're going to hear a much more aggressive onset. The sustain control determines the length of the filter envelope. So for example, if I reduce this, you'll notice the envelope works a lot quicker. And as I boost this control, everything happens a lot slower. So there's a quick look at all the different pages and parameters within MonoSynth. So the first preset that I've designed here is called Wham Lead Synth, and the idea being that I'm using a whammy pedal in order to create some cool textures. I've actually got 2 instances of the synth setup as well to go ahead and create some rhythmic texture as well. So let me go through how it's working. At the minute, we've just got our first synth block set up, and it's worth pointing out that I've actually mapped an expression pedal to the filter cutoff and the resonance. So I can do that from the ground. So that's what the first monosynth block is doing. The second monosynth block is creating a rhythmic texture on lane 3. And I've simply got the arpeggiator set up, just running the root in 16th notes, and I've actually got the decay of the global amp page down as low as 62 milliseconds, so it's a nice fast rhythmic sort of sound. So next on lane 1, we're taking this initial synth and we're throwing it into an amplifier, so it's going to sound like this. Adding way more aggression to it. And then before we incorporate the whammy pedal, I've also got some delay and some reverb happening as well. Now if I throw on the whammy, that's also controlled with my expression pedal. All together, we get this kind of sound. just to show you what's happening on the mono synth on lane 1. So that would be my Wham lead synth preset, which is just incorporating a few different parameters and making the use of an expression pedal just to get a bit more flexibility and texture out of this particular preset. The next preset I've made is a lead synth preset. This is inspired by some of the presets I've made with my Archetype plugin, which is basically using the mono synth into an amp and cab section and then having a little bit of EQ, reverb and delay to create a really nice, smooth lead synth preset. So let me show you what's happening in the mono synth. In terms of wave shape, we've got a triangular wave and a pulse, and that basically sounds like this. Everything else is fairly simple. We've got a little bit of resonance and drive on the filter section. We're not using the arpeggiator. On the global amp section, I haven't really touched it. So next, we'll throw on the amp. That's going to add way more aggression. But at this point, when we throw the cab on, it's going to soften the top end of this synth tone. And that's where things start to sound really smooth with regard to this lead preset. I'm adding EQ just to boost the top end a bit. And then when we add our delay and our reverb, the whole thing comes together and it's a really smooth ambient synth lead preset. So the next preset, I attempted to create something really aggressive and dirty bass kind of synth tone. So there's a bunch going on here, a bunch of different routing options, but essentially what's happening is I've got two instances of the mono synth and they're running into a series of different devices such as overdrive and fuzz amplifiers, and we're finishing it off with a bit crusher, which is a new device in CorOS 3.3.0, and then finally a whammy. So let me take you through. First things first, we've got our basic first synth here. We're not touching anything on the global and the amp setting. We're not using the arpeggiator, but I've got a pulse and a triangular wave happening here. And then on the filter, we've got a little bit of resonance again and a little bit of drive. So it sounds like this. Now on lanes 3 and 4, this is where I've added my second instance of mono synth. What's happening here? Again, not very much on the first page or the second page, but when we get to the oscillator, I'm actually running a whole octave down on both oscillators and they're both on square wave. And then over on the filter page, we've kind of untouched everything. We've added a little bit more on the cutoff and a little bit of drive, but that's it. Both together sound like this. So that's really cool. What happens next on both of these is that we're splitting off the signal and they run into their own pedal and amplifier section. So on lane 1, we split things off. One side goes to a fuzz and the other side goes to an amplifier, and it sounds like this. On the other side, we go into a Soviet fuzz, which is a bass fuzz, and then we're also running a sort of Ampeg style amplifier as well for our octave down synth. Sounds like this. So all those together sound like this. which is really, really cool. Already sounds very thick and aggressive. Now where it gets really fun is that we've added the new Bit Crusher device, and I've got that set at 3 bits and 1015 Hertz. I've basically just messed around with the controls until I felt it sounded good, and that's only affecting the top 2 rows. The bottom row is left untouched, but it sounds like this. So it just sounds kind of crazy. And then the final part of the puzzle is adding the whammy, which is mapped to this expression pedal on the floor here, just for a bit more fun. And finally, this is Air Synth. Now we've used different instances of mono synth across these presets. We've tried to utilize things like the Arpeggiator for some rhythmic texture and combining different devices to create lots of different textures, which I think is the beauty of having mono synth on Quad Cortex. But also I wanted to create something that was kind of a cinematic pad. Something that I really like to use a lot in my own work and arrangements is creating texture. And that's something that I find the mono synth is really useful for. So in this instance, we're basically trying to create a slow rising pad. So if I open up the mono synth, you can see at the moment we've got the attack set, so it's sort of a slow onset to the note. You can actually boost that a tiny, tiny bit. In the oscillator section, we're using the sawtooth and the sine wave. One's down an octave and one's up an octave with 5 unisons going on and a tiny bit of detune, just to create a little bit of width there. And in the filter section, we've got some drive and we've just changed to 24 dB per octave on the cutoff as well. That's around 4000 Hertz. So that's all the mono synth is doing at this point. The next thing that happens is it runs into this amp block here. I'm using a Bogner Vishnu 20th clean, which sounds like this. What's nice about that is it's just adding a little bit of texture with the fact that the gain's up so high. On certain notes that are oscillating by using the detune feature, it's kind of creating that texture there. After the amp block, we're actually splitting the signal, and what we're running into is a new device that's on CorOS 3.3.0, which is the pattern trem, and this is just going to serve as a little bit of texture in the finished product. So you probably won't notice it too much, but it's there, and it's just giving a little bit more dimension to the sound. And then I'm adding a doubler just for a little bit of extra width. And then what happens is the signal meets back up and it hits a delay and a reverb. And I'm using the circular delay with the mix at 50%. And then we're actually using the mind hole reverb, but the mix is almost all the way up at 86%, just so that it really creates that feeling of a sort of ambient pad. And that would be my Air Synth preset, which includes 4 kind of presets I've thrown together just to show you some of the flexibility that you can find by having monosynth in Quad Cortex. So in the time that I've been using the mono synth, I've noticed a couple of things that I think could be really useful for those of you out there that are running into similar situations. One of those being that because the mono synth is based on pitch detection, when we hit our pick against the string, it's creating its own pitch, if you like, and that's triggering the oscillators, and sometimes that results in glitches and pops and things like that, which I'll try and demonstrate now. Sometimes that can be a really nice texture in what you're playing and you want it in there, but if you don't, one of the things I've found to be really useful is if I move to my neck pickup on my guitar and I roll the tone all the way down. Essentially what's happening is it's killing some of that high-end information out of the input of the monosynth. All the monosynth is looking for is a pitch to trigger the oscillators, so it doesn't really matter that we've rolled our tone all the way down. I think that combats that situation really well. Another way you could do it is adding an EQ block before the synth and just low passing it, so to speak. So if I find myself an EQ block and I do a high and a low cut, and I go ahead and I lower to say 3000 Hertz, I can go back on my bridge pickup. And you'll find that probably has the same effect as rolling your tone down. Either way, this is a good tip I think will really help you. Another cool tip that I think is useful to you guys if you're using the monosynth, and something I like to do a lot, is if I'm using the Arpeggiator and I want to create a rhythmic synth, so to speak. In this instance, we're going to do 16th note sort of rhythmic synth. I'll take my Arpeggiator, I'm going to take off all the steps of the scale, I'm going to set it to 16th notes. And at the minute, we've just got a straight up. We're not really hearing the definition of those 16th notes. So if I go to my global and amp page, I find my decay and attack knob and I reduce this to say as little as sort of 40 milliseconds. I find that to be a really cool and easy way of creating a rhythmic synth. And of course the same applies if we boost that attack knob. But I find for me personally, having it in the decay setting allows it to be way more rhythmical and I can use it as a texture or a layer. So there is an overview of the new mono synth featured in CorOS 3.3.0. I hope from this short video you can see just how expansive and creative this new device can be. I personally love using it for sound design in my own arrangements, and I just think it's such a great addition to the Quad Cortex. It's worth saying that I'm just scratching the surface of what you can create using the monosynth in Quad Cortex. I think most of this comes through discovery of messing around with it yourself and finding out just how capable it is of creating some really wild sounds. And so I hope you really have a good time using monosynth. To find out more about Quad Cortex and CorOS 3.3.0, go to neuraldsp.com. Thank you for watching this video. I've been Rabia and I'll see you all very soon.